If you are trying to get a job immediately after you leave a job, your next job is going to look very similar to that job because that's what it says on your LinkedIn profile. That's who your contacts and recommendations are, which is fine. That might be the direction you want to head. But I think what a sabbatical asks us to do is to pause for a second, get some perspective about what other possible selves we could become, run some experiments about those possible selves, and give us a chance to pivot and be a little bit different.
For LinkedIn News, I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. Sometimes the best way to understand our work and to understand whether we want to stay at a job or move on to something else, it's to step away from it. I'm not talking about a vacation here or a long weekend. I mean to really take a sabbatical. And that's a really hard thing to do, of course, for a number of very real reasons, like money, time, responsibilities. But when we figure out how to take that time, we gain so much wisdom, perspective, and a real sense of the work that we want to be doing. Our guest today is DiDonna. He is a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School, and he's the author of the new book, Big Time Off, The Transformative Power of Sabbaticals and How to Take One. On his own sabbatical, DJ ran a poverty research lab at his alma mater, Notre Dame, and he walked 900 miles on pilgrimage in Japan. The experience changed the course of his life, and he believes that no matter who you are, a sabbatical can do the same for you. Here's DiDonna.
The reason I use the term sabbatical, and I think so many people do, is because it lends kind of prestige and gives you like permission to do something that is pretty scary and nameless, and so you're kind of borrowing from this academic sense of like, I'm on sabbatical, I'm doing something. And what I say in the book is that I actually don't like the term sabbatical. I wish we lived in a world where you don't have to use it, but we do need to give ourselves some sort of title and some sort of permission. So the definition that I came up with is this extended leave away from routine work on purpose. And that doesn't mean that you choose to go on sabbatical, because I think 2/3 of sabbaticals happen because of a negative catalyst, like it happens to you. Health crisis, job crisis, relationship crisis. But once you are off from your routine job, you stay there for a period. And that period, ideally, 3 to 6 months, ideally it takes between 6 to 8 weeks to truly feel like yourself again and take that kind of work identity off. And so that's kind of where I've landed on it.
Your interest in sabbaticals began with the sabbatical that you were forced to take. Tell us the story of that.
My sabbatical, there's two ways to tell the story. One is this kind of typical burnout. I ran a startup. We were working across emerging markets, had a great mission. And so I think especially when you have a mission, this is where the definition of burnout came from. You're trying to put other people in front of you, and then you end up burning yourself out. So there's that story where just over the course of 7-8 years of running a company, I kind of ground down and just wasn't my best self. But then the second version is that I was felt pulled towards something else. I felt pulled towards things that I felt that were important, but never seemingly urgent.
Yep.
So the spiritual search, spending a lot of intense time with my family during a hard time, focusing on relationships and just kind of shedding a bit of that layer and identity that was my dream job. I created my dream job. I was fortunate to do that. But you change and evolve and grow over time.
How old were you for that first sabbatical?
I was 32.
32.
32.
Yeah. So give me the practical on it. Like you left for how long did you leave? What did you do? How did you figure out what you were going to do?
Yeah. I'll preface by saying that one of the challenges with talking about anyone's sabbatical, my sabbatical at that time, is that everyone has a different season for what is possible in their life. Whether you have a certain set of responsibilities or constraints around the geography you can travel in or costs. So at that point in time, I had just gotten out of a relationship. I had no responsibilities. So I wanted to engage in this spiritual search. I spent first, about 6 weeks with my mom, cooking her dinner every night. She recovered from an illness, which is, not glamorous. It's not something you put on the marquee, but was really kind of meaningful, I think, to both of us. And then I set off on this pilgrimage, this Buddhist pilgrimage in Japan. So you visit these 88 temples, you walk to them. And I did that for about 6 weeks. And so that gave me the chance to process the grief around what I knew I needed to leave my company. Living out of a suitcase for 8 years, it just was not didn't correspond with the type of relationships I wanted to have. And also gave me time to investigate the spiritual side of me, which I always felt was important to me, but had not spent any time really working on. Learned that I should not be a monk, even though I've got the haircut for it, and was able to kind of make space and have the confidence for the uncertainty around what would come next, because I had no idea what would come next.
So I want to move to that part of the story, which is so you shed your old identity. And I think so many people can connect to this idea that you work at a place for a certain time, and pretty soon it becomes difficult to discern the difference between your values and that place's values, or who you are versus who you are in the context of that place. And then you move into a period of not knowing, which is a very uncomfortable period to be in for just about anyone I've ever met. What happens next for you, and how long does it take?
I notified my co-founders that I needed to leave. I think everybody knew that was coming.
Sure.
And I gave this poverty research organization the nod that, hey, I'm going to volunteer my time for the second half of the year, so 6 months. Can I help?
Yeah.
And they said, why don't you come and run it and help them transition from 2 academics running it into a full-time real kind of managing director. And so I moved to South Bend, Indiana.
So you're in South Bend.
Yeah.
And the emotional experience of that is at that point, it sounds to me like at that point, you've had this time with your family, you've had this time to unwind, you've had this experience in Japan. You actually have a little bit of an open mind and an open moment, and you do this work. At what point would you call the sabbatical over and you had moved into your next chapter? Or is it not that clear cut?
That's an interesting question because, functionally I was unemployed, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I gave myself until the end of the year because I realized that one of the things I gained on my sabbatical was this confidence that I can make money in the future. And so I can either stress about it or I can give myself a little bit more space to figure out what's next that I would not have had before, this uncertainty around what's next. And I stayed in that liminal space of, I know I'm temporarily going to be in South Bend for this, interim job. And I'm going to lean into the space and the possibilities and really allow myself to be anything again. Yeah. And that's how I started this journey of, writing and teaching. It could not be more different from what I was doing before.
I mean, it really is a very different role, different industry, if you want to call it that, different occupation, different vocation. And you're at a place now where you're reintegrated, right? You feel I hope, a connection to the work that you're doing and a connection absent the burnout that was plaguing you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I view, my life as kind of chapters answering hypotheses, right? Yeah. So I had that 7-year chapter. This 7-year chapter has been bringing the book to life and those ideas to life. Yeah. And, there's going to be time for a new chapter coming up.
Well, that's an intriguing idea. But I want to talk about then sort of what you have learned about sabbaticals broadly. And also, I want to just call out the fact that when you took your sabbatical, we were in a very different economic landscape. Mm-hmm. We were pre-pandemic. We were in sort of boom time, as it were. And the idea of saving a bunch of money and leaving the job force made sense because if you were an educated person, you could assume that you would most likely be able to get back into the job force. Mm-hmm. But those assumptions are different right now, and I want to know how that impacts our thoughts about sabbaticals.
Well, I think the other story around that time was that, when I first shopped out my book proposal, it was the fall of 2020, right? And so everyone thought it was a bad time to talk about sabbaticals. Then in 2021, you had the Great Resignation, right? And so I think we've seen a similar thing with AI where we had this immediate kind of constriction of jobs and opportunities, people laying off, and now companies going back and saying actually we were just kind of trimming the fat from overhiring before. It's not clear that the disruptions will be as kind of intense as people thought they were. Jury's still out, obviously. But I do think that it goes in cycles. And one of the things that I find compelling about this, having seen it for 10 years, is that we've been kind of like an urgency cycle for a decade, and there's never been a good time.
Yep.
And so my question for folks is, are you going to allow your life to be dictated by the machinations and the intensity and the urgency around you? Or are you going to do the work to plan something far enough in advance, 5 years? What are you doing in 2031?
Yeah.
Where you can actually make space for yourself to do something that's really important to you.
I love this idea, and you and I have spoken about it before, of really thinking ahead over the long arc of your career and planning for a future sabbatical.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why you might do that is because economically, I'm just going to acknowledge this isn't easy for everyone to take. In fact, it's not easy for most people to simply say in the midst of their working life, I'm going to take this period out and not produce income directly.
Yep.
One thing I'd love to understand is like what counts as a sabbatical, right? Because often when people do that, it's because they've actually lost their job. They've been laid off. That's happening a lot right now.
Yeah. I think that, going back to my definition, if you can make space where you're not looking for a job, when you lose your job is to find another job. That's like our instinct, and that makes sense. If you can make space to imagine and experiment with a different possibility for yourself, I think especially in the time of AI, I coach a lot of executives who, they're expected to upskill on AI in addition to all the other things they're doing, right? Yeah. And I think, A, there's no time. And B, it makes you kind of learn and engage with it from a state of fear versus love. So when those folks have stepped away, they've actually been able to, run little kind of creative projects with their kids and with their family, or design something that delights them. Like my wife and I designed like a bookshelf kind of identification tool. So you can go into an independent bookstore and see like what are the staff recommendations so that we can get better book recommendations. That's fun, that's light, and then you can bring that knowledge of AI back to the workplace in a way that, would be stressful and it'd feel like another job if you can't.
So it sounds to me like part of the definition of a sabbatical then is not the job loss per se, but the decision in the face of job loss not to immediately search for another job.
Yeah, and I liken it to grocery shopping while hungry, right? Like if you are trying to get a job immediately after you leave a job or lose a job, your next job is going to look very similar to that job because that's what it says on your LinkedIn profile. That's who your contacts and recommendations are, which is fine. That might be the direction you want to head. But I think what a sabbatical asks us to do is to pause for a second, get some perspective about what other possible selves we could become, run some experiments about those possible selves, and give us a chance to kind of like pivot and be a little bit different. If you want to go back to exactly what you're doing, great. But what I would advocate for, especially now, is you have to step back and figure out where the economy, where the world is going, and kind of like skate to the puck, as Wayne Gretzky would say, as opposed to just like keeping your head down and, following in the same rut that you're in now. It might not be heading to the right direction.
Yeah.
So I think a sabbatical allows you that perspective. I had someone describe it as a near-death experience, where you're floating above your life to date, and you're also looking forward to like the end of your career and saying, what would I like this to be like? What would I like to try? What will I regret not doing?
Your book is made up of so many stories of people who have taken meaningful sabbaticals. And so many of them are just very different than your own personal story. So give me a story that shows me a very different way of thinking about a sabbatical.
So, one of my favorite stories, some of my favorite stories as a category are folks that have kids. Because, of course, it's more difficult and complicated and logistically tough to take your kids out of school. And, how old are they? Are they doing summer school? That kind of thing. There was someone who worked at a tech company in Boston, and they had 2 kids. His wife had stepped out of the workforce to raise their 2 kids, but she wanted to get back in the workforce. She was a teacher. And she was also from Norway, right? And so she found out about this school on this island on the coast of Norway where she could, help run the school, help teach. And then he took off from his job. So while they were there, their kids went to school in Norway. They got a chance to learn the language. He got a chance to do things that had nothing to do with his work, like fish and, hike and walk around. He was playing around with app development. So he created this kind of text-to-speech app. And then every afternoon he would have what he called daddy days. And so he'd spend one 1 hour, a couple hours with one kid, and then a couple hours with the other kid. So they got kind of one-on-one time with him that they would never get in normal life. And, as the days started to shrink and the nights started to increase, he really dug in on experimenting with this app and saying, he'd been a CTO, and so you get so far away from the front lines of that thing that you were passionate about, this like engineering. And he ended up creating this app, and he went to publish it on this kind of open source platform. And the moderator said, this is actually really good. You should think about, putting it on the App Store. And he put it on the App Store and just got these, kind of like slow trickle of signups. They went back to the States, and they realized that they could live on a much smaller amount of money because they lived on her salary.
Yeah.
Obviously, teacher salary in Norway is a lot higher than it is in Boston.
Yes, indeed. And it's also a pretty profound thing to step away and recalibrate and understand what you actually need.
Totally. And so they had this new relationship with money where they said, if this app can grow a little bit longer, and if she can get a job in teaching, they can live a little bit more leanly as they did in Norway. And also, he decided to take the summers off. And so he could align his time off with her and spend those short, 6 or so summers with his kids before they went off to school.
Right.
So they're able to design a life that was totally different coming back. And right now, actually, his kid is in a sabbatical year in Norway, where you can go there as a kid after you graduate from high school. It's fully paid by the government. You learn, mountaineering and language and things like that. So
you have to be Norwegian, I assume, or have a parent who's Norwegian?
No. It's pretty rare that folks would investigate these types of things. And so that's one of the things that I hope the book is doing, is shining a light on these like very different ways of working and living that just aren't part of our typical story about how to work and live. But people have found a way. And I think that, the goal is to normalize this and enable people of all kind of like socioeconomic levels to take it, which is going to require companies to offer them. We're going to require societies to honor them, right?
Okay, so let's talk about corporate sabbaticals, because that is a thing. And in the 25 years that I have been a business reporter, every few years I'll be pitched a story. But I remember it was like in 2003, it was PwC by a company who offers these extended periods off.
Yep.
By extended, it's usually 4 weeks, 6 weeks.
A European vacation, yeah.
Is this a sabbatical? I mean, is that a sabbatical, or is that misbranding?
So I don't want to throw shade on any extended leave. I think that extended leave is a gateway drug to longer leave, because you realize how amazing it is to have 4 weeks off, how short it actually is, and you get a taste of kind of what you would want to do if you had more time.
Yeah.
I think that, you hear this trend about, many sabbaticals and micro sabbaticals, and everyone wants to figure out how you can get all of the benefits in like a small amount of time.
It's like listening to a podcast on 2X.
Exactly. I have a friend who said, if you're asking me what's the shortest amount of time I can visit Paris, then I can tell that you need to spend more time in Paris.
Yeah.
And so, listen, I think those kinds of breaks are worthwhile, and I want to encourage that. But I really do think that taking more than 6 weeks, taking more than 8 weeks to really get out, partially as a forcing function for the company to get the work done without you.
Yeah.
One of the biggest differences between a vacation and sabbatical is that when you're on vacation, in the back of your mind that work is piling up.
Yeah.
Right? When you're on sabbatical, when you're on parental leave, it's long enough that the company has to find a way to get the work done.
Right.
You have to find a way to divvy the responsibilities, give them out to folks, reincorporate when you get back. So it's a way for organizations to build resilience. It's a way for people to, junior people to kind of upskill and have stretch experiences while you're gone. And especially with a sabbatical, it can be equitable for everybody. You don't have to want to have kids to step away. When you're carrying the water for someone else to take a sabbatical, if it's available to everyone, they're going to carry water for you later. And so it becomes like a culture building. Okay,
so you said when you're on sabbatical or when you are on parental leave, people have to figure out how to get the work done. Are sabbatical and parental leave synonymous?
Well, as you know, I just had a kid. And so my parental leave is very short because I'm launching a book baby and then a baby. And I'd be curious to hear about your sabbatical, because I think a lot of people are forced to use the sabbatical to just do some other job.
Yeah.
I mean, academic sabbaticals are you're putting two of your jobs aside, like departmental meetings and teaching, and then you have to do the research and the writing, which is actually how you get promoted, right?
Right.
And so this notion of like an achiever archetype in a sabbatical, I talk about achievers, explorers, and seekers. You're swapping out your routine job for another job-like task. And what we found in the research is that that can still be very restorative. It can still be life-changing because it's something that you're choosing from intrinsic motivation, right? But it's not restful in the same way, obviously.
I was going to say there is so much labor involved in care, right? And parental leave for many people is so care specific.
Yeah.
Family leave is care specific. Many people step outside of the workforce for a while because they have an aging relative with Alzheimer's or any number of care related reasons. That can also, it can be exhausting. It can be more labor than the labor you are stepping away from. I would argue that that's not a sabbatical.
Yeah. Well, I think the counterfactual of that is that you have something that demands your care and time, and you don't have the time to give it.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it from like, how do you want to spend your life?
Yeah.
I have people in the book where, one brother was, by the bedside for 2 months taking care of his dying father.
Right.
And the other brother was working as a lawyer.
Yeah.
And so that's not restful, but it is life-changing and life-fulfilling in a way that, what are we doing here if we can't take time off to care for our child, care for our parents? It doesn't feel like sipping coconuts on the beach, but that's human, that's important. And I'm arguing to make space for it. So that's where I think this word sabbatical can be limiting for some folks, because they think about, what I did or a travel year or something like that. It's really just an extended time to be more human.
I love thinking about it that way. And you asked about my own sabbatical, and I told you before we started this recording, I wouldn't call that a sabbatical. And yet here we are halfway through our conversation. I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of was a sabbatical.
Yeah.
And that was a period of time during which I was on the hook to write a book. And my wife had just given birth to our second child. And I won't tell you that it was a restful time. It was not a restful time. But I stepped so far outside the responsibilities of my daily life that I could engage deeply in being the kind of parent that I wanted to be and in completing this incredible project of a lifetime. And I would say, without a doubt, that it was the most impactful 3 months of my life. Not of my career, of my life, right? And yet I worked so hard. And maybe this is about timing in one's life or seasons. Curious your thoughts. Right now I feel like I'm craving a sabbatical because I want to find out what happens if I stop working.
Yeah. I love that. I've heard that so much. And I think that's where, going back to the definition of a sabbatical, why we call that a sabbatical versus I had a period in my life where I stepped back and I brought two amazing creations to life, your book and your baby, right? And also it's kind of like the prototypical American sabbatical where we swap out our job, our all-consuming job, for paying attention to two other new jobs. And still great and still one of the most memory-dense periods of your life. But it's a little bit tragic that we can't give ourselves permission to just step off the treadmill, as what you just said, and into kind of a liminal space that, William Bridges calls fertile emptiness.
Yeah.
So like this, what comes up when you actually don't have anything, when you don't know what you're going to do next? And that was the grounds that I was able to step into. We shouldn't have to call it a sabbatical. We shouldn't have to kind of grind our teeth around how we can't afford to do it or can't think about how we should do it. So that's the world that I'm envisioning and trying to bring to life.
Yeah. I think it's particularly powerful to think about that world against the backdrop of the moment that we are in now. As we move from industrialization, the idea of a job was not a word that people applied to what they did during the day before industrialization and the rise of factories over the course of the 20th century. You moved to a world that said, actually, we're gonna measure your identity by that economic output. So here we are in this moment of great uncertainty and turbulence and chaos as the world around us reckons with the shift from industrialization to whatever happens next. And any thesis that I told you for how it was going to work out would be dead wrong. It's really too early to know. We're at the earliest stages of it. But we are in a moment where we might be able to re-envision like what our humanity is and what our relationship to economic output is. And it feels to me like a sabbatical is a beautiful tool, like a promise and permission for us to do that.
I don't think I need to add anything to that. No.
Am I taking it too far? Have I?
No, I mean, listen, I think that on the point of output, my understanding, first of all, the weekend was created 100 years ago, right? And so this stuff is all within our control to change. The 40-hour work week was kind of changed and adjusted during World War II as kind of the British kind of Department of War was figuring out what's the amount of working, at which case the production dips enough, right? So that's how they kind of calibrated that. And then, really thinking about, Keynes talked about, as you have more productivity, we should have more leisure time, right? We can get the same amount of things done in a shorter amount of time. What we've seen is that we then reinvest that extra time into more and more productivity.
Yes.
And so I think now is an inflection point for us to say, like, at what point do we get more done because of AI and then allow ourselves more leisure time or more time for work that matters to us, family, personal projects, what the future holds, versus allow it to be taken by the attention-grabbing machine and, whatever kind of additional forces of capitalism and whatnot are coming at us.
I rather like the idea that a sabbatical may offer us the opportunity to explore what work really matters to us.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think the idea of more leisure time is kind of bunk. It's not actually something that humans want.
Yeah.
Work is the way that we forge connections with each other and figure out how to develop purpose in our lives.
Yeah.
It feels to me like what a sabbatical may offer us is the opportunity to move away from work for the sake of economic output and therefore toward work that matters to us because it matters.
Mm-hmm. I will say I'm gonna stop you because when you get to take that fertile emptiness sabbatical,
right?
I want to talk to you about leisure time and your desire for it.
I don't believe in leisure time. I'm bad at it.
Yeah.
It's terrible. I've never had it. I wouldn't know what to do with
exactly.
it.
So one of my good friends who is a C-level executive at a big tech company, when she took her sabbatical, she was like, I'm learning Python and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And about 3 months in, I went back to revisit her and she's like, I'm doing one hike with a good friend each day. And I baked my daughter cupcakes for her birthday and brought it into her class. And she's not someone who would think that she's like a baked cupcake and bring it into class person.
Yes.
And I watched her do this kind of dip into leisure in a way where she got to the place where she didn't feel guilty about it. Mm-hmm. And I think we live in this soup, and I call it functional workaholism in the book, where it's not like we're not like at the edge of burnout. We're not burning out necessarily. We're in this soup of workaholism where we can't even imagine giving ourselves the gift of more leisure time and not feeling bad about it.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is I think we feel bad about it when we're not productive.
Yeah.
And I think you can't experience it until you do it yourself. And you realize that the soup that you were living in, the way you were working, actually was not that healthy and that there's more ways to live. So it's about looking at more ways to live and choosing, do I want to go back to the old way I was working? Do I want to tweak it a little bit? Do I want to change completely? All of those are fine, but at least giving yourself the moment to consider that and to act intentionally versus being swept away by whatever the current is around AI or crypto or this revolution or that, and just be more intentional about how you want to live and work.
That was DJ DiDonna, author of Big Time Off. It's available wherever books are sold, and I hope you check it out. And even more than that, I hope you find time in your life for yourself. Time to dream, time to step away from work. This is Hello Monday, and I am Jessi Hempel. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you right back here next week. Hello Monday is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Ava Ahmedbegi and Rachel Karp. Sound design and engineering by Asaf Gedron. The show is mixed by Tim Boland. Our theme music was composed just for us by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. Michaela Greer is a friend of the show forever, as is Victoria Taylor. Kyle Ranson-Walsh is editor-at-large of editorial graphics. Courtney Coop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. I'm Jessi Hempel. This is Hello Monday. See you next week.